Thank you, Anne. Thanks for inviting me to attempt to talk to the subject. A bit difficult after hearing Kevin and Michael, but I'm going to go ahead. As some of you know, I'm an ethnographer and have done extensive fieldwork in West Africa and Aboriginal Australia. In these remote societies, where I've lived and worked over many years, people do not identify any discrete existential domain that equates to our word religion. So when I came to HDS in 2005, I was seriously challenged by how I could engage with religious studies from standpoints that seemed quite foreign to the traditions that constituted the core curriculum here. Though I soon began to ask myself whether this apparent gap between the life worlds I had studied and the life worlds my colleagues studied was a product of our different methods rather than a reflection of the phenomena themselves. I certainly didn't want to fall back on the antiquated and Eurocentric view that societies like the Koranko of Sierra Leone and the Warlpiri of Central Australia were primitive, animist, or pantheist. For on the one hand, these pejorative terms completely failed to do justice to the complexity of these worldviews, and on the other hand, the terms could just as easily be applied to many aspects of life in Judeo-Christian, Buddhist, or Islamic societies. Was it possible, therefore, to identify any existential givens common to all human beings, despite the different ways they represented reality to themselves, or the academic conventions that chopped this reality up into discrete domains, the religious, the economic, the political, the psychological, the rational, the irrational, and so forth? I begin with an assumption that's been born of my ethnographic experience, namely that human beings everywhere are perplexed and provoked by the mystery of how the human relates to the extra-human, which is to say, everything that lies beyond our immediate comprehension and control. Experiences that we call religious are therefore connected with limits and limitations, with those critical junctures in life when we come up against the limits of what we can say or do and what we can think or know. In the book I wrote during my first 2 years at HDS, I borrowed Karl Jasper's concept of Grenzsituation, border situations, to theorize this penumbral zone between what is in the light and what lies in the shadows. I also took my cues from Wallace Stevens' compelling image in his late poem of mere being, where the palm at the end of the mind stands beyond thought, on the edge of space, while a gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song, to capture something of the indeterminate and ambiguous realm between the hotel and the hymn, as Stevens has it, the human and the divine. During the period that I was working on this book, I would occasionally take a walk to stretch my legs and clear my head, often passing 95 Irving Street, where William James lived between 1889 and 1910 and wrote his most enduring work. There's a commemorative plaque on the stone gray picket fence, and the house, still a private home, has been well maintained. Sometimes my passing contact with this house brought to mind a passage in James' writing that resonated with my own work in progress and helped me clarify what I was struggling to say. One cold March morning, for instance, I was passing the house just as a City of Cambridge recycling collection truck was moving laboriously down the street, as if to remind me that I was simply putting back into circulation ideas that James had set down 100 years ago. Here's an example. Reality, life, experience, concreteness, immediacy, use what word you will, exceeds our logic, overflows and surrounds it. This from his lecture given in Oxford in the spring of 1908, where he added, "By reality, I mean where things happen." One can, I think, readily understand why James' notion of radical empiricism, with its emphasis on relations as well as relata, flights and perchings, rivers and embankments, verbs and substantives, conjunctions and disjunctions, proved so difficult to spell out and so irksome to many of his readers, for who in his right mind would identify reality with things that cannot be readily grasped or systematically named, with phenomena outside the reach of reason? Yet James insisted, "Our fields of experience have no more definite boundaries than have our fields of view. Both are fringed forever by a more that continuously develops and that continuously supersedes them as life proceeds. The relations, generally speaking, are as real as the terms are." Nor is it that the world that lies about us that is refractory to comprehension and control. It is also the world within. Again, James, whatever it may be on the farther side, the more with which in religious experience we feel ourselves connected is on the hither side the subconscious continuation of our conscious life. There is probably no human being who has not been intrigued and troubled by the mysterious relationship between his or her own immediate world, a world of direct experience, and all that lies beyond it. It is never simply a matter of acknowledging or naming this extra-mundane dimension of our existence. It is more vitally a question of our relationship with it, how we reckon with it, draw on it, and control it. Of this liminal zone, John Dewey observed, "The visible is set in the invisible, and in the end, what is unseen decides what happens in the seen. The tangible rests precariously upon the untouched and ungrasped. The contrast and potential maladjustment of the immediate, the conspicuous, and focal phase of things, with these indirect and hidden factors which determine the origin and career of what is present, are indestructible features of any and every experience." Although we often assume that reason enables us to grasp the unseen intellectually, if not actually, Dewey declares that this invocation of scientific rationality is as much a magical safeguard against the uncertain character of the world as the so-called mumbo-jumbo and superstition we attribute to pre-modern peoples. Dewey's remarks echo certain passages in William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, where he too speaks of the ways in which our private and mundane lives are embedded in wider fields of being from which we draw inspiration and vitality. Unfortunately, time doesn't permit me to go into a Karanko exposition of how this is theorized for them as a relationship between the town and the bush, between what is, as it were, the moral space of the community and the wild or antinomian space of the bush. But it bears an uncanny resemblance to Dewey's formulation, and this is something that I have been intrigued with for many years, that the thoughts that have been produced by Western philosophers are often directly comparable to the images that have been produced in the non-Western world, and often disparaged as an inadequate articulation of understanding, which is exactly the point that Michael was just making about ritual theorization. Though there are countless ways in which any one of us construes and interacts with this non-immediate realm, James prefers to speak of it in fairly neutral terms as a wider self, or the more, or simply life, rather than as God. As such, it bears a family resemblance to what Freud called the over-I, Jaspers called the encompassing, and Heidegger called Dasein. As a pragmatist, James is less concerned with whether our language actually captures the essence of the elusive world that lies about us or inside us. since what is most crucial are the entailments of what we say and do for our own well-being and the well-being of others. Does God really exist, he asks. How does he exist? What is he? Are so many irrelevant questions. Not God, but life, more life, a larger, richer, more satisfying life is, in the last analysis, the end of religion. Basic to all these reflections is the view that one's well-being depends on one's relationships or connectedness to an elsewhere or otherness that lies beyond the horizons of one's own immediate life world. And that's the rationale for being an ethnographer. This other world is sometimes identified with the dead, and ritual labor enables the living to fuse their being with ancestral being in a life-giving union. Sometimes, as in traditional Christianity, it is a realm of divine power and presence associated with the empyrean. And of course, etymologically, the word for deity, deos, is from the root meaning the bright sky or daylight. Sometimes it is identified with the natural environment of the bush, as among the Koranko, or with the landscape itself, which is the case in Central Australia. Although, as Alfred Schutz observes, most philosophy and religion attempt to reduce the extra-mundane to a concept, to make it graspable and accessible to accustomed experience, to tame it, it remains at the limits of what can be thought or said, encompassing our relationships with ancestors, nature, God, foreigners, and even the unborn. And this is the limit at which I think ethnographers work, and as I've come to learn from being at the HDS, many scholars of religion work, so I've come to feel finally at home here. Thank you.